Revenge with Ava. The day I realized my life had been edited out of its own story was the day my badge stopped working, even though I was still standing in the same marble lobby where I'd built my career one late night at a time. The security light blinking red like an accusation, while people in expensive shoes stepped around me as if I'd become furniture, and I remember how the air smelled, lemon polish and cold coffee, and how my palms stayed oddly dry, because somewhere deep inside I'd already expected this kind of cruelty from men like Logan Whitmore, the company's golden CEO who smiled for cameras and broke people in private, the same Logan who used to text me good morning like it meant something, the same Logan who once promised in a quiet corner of an elevator that I was the only person in the building who told him the truth, and now the same Logan who had my access revoked before sunrise. Before I could even defend myself against the rumor he'd poured into the halls like gasoline, that I'd leaked confidential data to a competitor, that I'd been unstable, that I'd been emotional, that I'd been hard to manage, all the easy words men use to erase women the second we stop being useful. And as I stood there with my laptop bag strapped to my shoulder and my head held up like a weapon, I watched him glide past the security gates with his fiancée on his arm, Sloane Mercer, all silk and perfect teeth, the kind of woman who looked like she'd been designed by a brand team. While he didn't even glance at me, not a flicker of recognition, as if the 2 years I spent carrying his chaos and protecting his image had never happened. And when Sloane finally noticed me, because women always notice other women first, she looked me up and down slowly, then leaned closer to Logan and murmured something that made him smirk. And that smirk, God, that smirk, was the same one he used the night he convinced me to cover for him when he missed a board meeting because he was sick. Which actually meant he was drunk in a penthouse suite with someone whose name I never asked. And I remember thinking, in that lobby, that maybe this was what betrayal looked like when it wore a tailored suit and a diamond ring, because I wasn't just being fired, I was being framed, and the worst part was how cleanly they did it, like they'd practiced the choreography, HR waiting upstairs, my manager suddenly unavailable, a pre-printed termination packet with my name spelled correctly for the first time in months, and a legal clause that tried to gag me with money they knew I couldn't afford to refuse, and still I didn't cry, because the moment I saw that red light blink, a different kind of feeling took over, something calm and cold and determined, like the part of me that used to believe in fairness finally stepped aside and let the survivor take the wheel. So I walked upstairs without pleading, without begging, without giving them the satisfaction of watching me break. And when HR slid the papers across the table with that fake soft voice telling me it was unfortunate and necessary, I stared straight at the line that said gross misconduct and laughed once, quietly, because it was absurd, because I had the receipts in my inbox, I had the calendar invites, the late night calls, the approvals, the back channel messages where Logan told me exactly what to do and when to do it, and I had something else too. Something I'd been pretending wasn't there because I didn't want to believe a man could be that careless. A private folder on my encrypted drive labeled Whitmore, stuffed with screenshots, and forwarded emails and audio files I'd saved for safety. A habit I'd picked up the first time I watched him throw someone else under the bus, and back then I told myself it was just insurance, just smart, just in case. But in that HR office, I realized it was a map, and if you follow a map long enough, you eventually find where the bodies are buried. So I signed nothing, I said nothing, I stood up, and I told them I'd have my attorney review it, which made the HR woman's eyes widen like she hadn't expected me to have teeth, and I walked out with my dignity intact. But the second the elevator doors closed, my knees almost gave out, not from fear, but from the rush of adrenaline that comes when your life is shoved off a cliff and your body hasn't caught up yet, And as I rode down to the garage, I replayed the last 3 months in my head, like a film I didn't want to watch, because it wasn't just a firing. It was a setup that started the moment Logan announced his engagement, and I remembered the night he told me in his office, fingers tapping the glass desk, that he needed me to stay close because things were sensitive, and I remembered how he looked at me when he said it, not like a partner, not like a friend, but like a tool he didn't want to lose. And I remembered how, after that, Sloane started showing up more, hovering in meetings she didn't belong in, smiling too brightly, always watching me, always making small comments that sounded harmless, but landed like needles. Like when she introduced me to a room full of executives as Logan's assistant, even though I was director of strategic ops, even though my job was to run entire divisions while Logan played visionary for investors. And I corrected her, politely, and she laughed like it was cute that I had ambition, and later Logan pulled me aside and said, "Just let it go, okay?" She stressed, and that was the moment I understood the rules. Her discomfort mattered, my identity didn't, and I should have left then. I should have walked away from the man who kept me in the shadows while borrowing my light. But I didn't, because I was loyal, because I was proud, because I believed I could outwork anything, and because, in the quietest part of my heart, I still wanted Logan to prove I hadn't imagined what we were. And that was my mistake, because men like Logan don't love, they leverage, and I was leverage until I became liability, and the day I stopped being useful was the day Sloane decided I was a threat. Not because I wanted Logan back, I didn't, but because she could tell I knew him in a way she never would. I'd seen him without the stage lights, without the speeches, without the perfect hair. I'd seen the rage flashes and the panic and the lies. And I'd watched him sign decisions that hurt people and call it strategy. And if she ever found out I had proof of how his empire really ran, her ring would turn into a shackle overnight. So she did what women like Sloane do when they're afraid. She smiled, she played gracious, and she sharpened the knife behind her back. And I didn't realize how deep the plan went until I reached my car and my phone started exploding with texts from coworkers. Messages that didn't ask what happened, but assumed like I'm so sorry and I can't believe you did that. And they're saying the FBI might get involved. And my stomach turned. Because it wasn't just an internal accusation. They were trying to ruin me publicly, to poison my name so thoroughly that no one would hire me. And as I sat there, gripping my steering wheel, I saw a notification from a number I didn't recognize. And when I opened it, a single photo appeared, a screenshot of a news draft, a headline that read something like Whitmore tech exec accused of data leak, and my name was in it, spelled correctly, bolded like a warning label, and underneath, a sentence that said I was terminated and under investigation, and at the bottom, a timestamp showing it had been prepared before my badge even stopped working, which meant the story had been written before the crime was even discovered, which meant this wasn't reaction, it was execution, and I stared at that screen while the world narrowed down to one brutal truth. Logan was willing to destroy me to protect himself, and Sloane was willing to watch it happen with a champagne flute in her hand. And the strangest thing was, as angry as I felt, there was also relief, because the confusion was gone, the question marks were gone, the part of me that kept trying to be. Reasonable was gone, and in its place was clarity like glass, and I whispered to myself, inside that silent car, okay, like I was accepting a challenge, because if they wanted war, they had picked the wrong woman, and I didn't need to scream to win, I just needed to be smarter than them. So I drove home slowly, not because I was defeated, but because I was thinking, because revenge isn't a burst of rage, it's a plan. And by the time I pulled into my apartment lot, the plan was already forming, sharp and steady, built from the pieces of everything I'd learned inside that company. Because I knew their weaknesses, I knew their blind spots, I knew the way they hid their worst decisions behind compliance language. And I knew one more thing. Logan Whitmore was terrified of one thing above all else, losing control of the narrative, because his company wasn't built on truth. It was built on perception, on investor confidence and glossy press releases, and carefully curated interviews. And if someone cracked that image in public, even slightly, the whole empire would start to wobble, and that someone was me, because while they were busy writing a story, where I was the villain, I was sitting on the real story, the one with emails and recordings and signatures, the one that showed Logan wasn't just unethical, he was criminal. And as I stepped into my apartment and locked the door behind me, I didn't collapse, I didn't fall apart, I went straight to my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up the folder I'd sworn I'd never need, and there it was, staring back at me like a loaded gun, the audio file from the night Logan told me, in his own voice, to move the numbers around before quarterly reporting. The email thread where he ordered me to bury A, harassment complaint because we don't need drama right now, the calendar invite for the meeting he skipped while I covered, and, most importantly, the chain from 3 weeks ago where he forwarded me a confidential merger packet and told me to send it to the consultant. Except the consultant's email address didn't match any firm, and when I traced it months earlier out of curiosity, it linked to a shell company tied to a competitor, meaning the leak they were accusing me of might actually be his, and my blood ran cold as I realized what they were doing. They weren't just firing me. They were using me as a firewall, a disposable scapegoat to take the fall for Logan's mess. And if I didn't fight back, I would be the one facing lawsuits, maybe charges, while Logan walked down the aisle in a custom tux under a ceiling of white flowers, smiling like a saint, and that image burned in my mind until my hands stopped shaking and started moving, because I knew exactly where to hit them first, not the police, not yet, because institutions move slow, and Logan had friends. But the one place Logan couldn't control once it started, public attention, the court of opinion, the kind of exposure that makes investors ask questions and board members panic and journalists sniff blood in the water. And I had one friend in the only place that mattered, a reporter named Dana Pike, a woman who used to cover tech scandals with the patience of a hunter, and I hadn't spoken to her in a year. Not since I fed her an anonymous tip that saved a group of employees from being quietly laid off. And if Dana still trusted me, she could be my first domino. So I drafted a message with care. Not emotional, not messy, just a clean sentence with a hook. I've been framed for a data leak at. Whitmore Tech. I have proof the leak came from the CEO's office. If you want the real story, call me. Then I stared at it for 5 full minutes before pressing send, because once you light the match, you don't get to pretend you didn't want the fire. And the moment it left my outbox, something inside me settled, like my spine locked into place. And then my phone rang, not Dana, but my former manager, Craig, a man who'd always been polite to my face and cowardly behind my back. And I let it ring twice before answering. And his voice came through, too calm, too rehearsed, telling me, listen, Mia, this doesn't have to get ugly, and I smiled. Because it was already ugly, he just didn't. Want it to be loud? And I said, it got ugly when you let them call me a criminal. And he sighed like I was being inconvenient, like my life was paperwork, and he said, Logan wants to offer you a severance. Generous. But you need to sign the agreement today. And I asked, the one that says I can't talk? And he paused, then said standard. And I said, tell Logan I'm not for sale. And Craig's voice tightened, and he said, you're making a mistake. And I leaned back in my chair, eyes on that folder full of proof, and I said, no, Craig. I'm correcting one. And I hung up, and for the first time all day I felt something like power. Not the kind that comes from a title, but the kind that comes from knowing the truth and choosing to use it. And that night, While the city outside my window blurred with rain, I didn't sleep. I organized everything. I labeled files. I created duplicates. I backed them up in 3 places because if I was going to walk into a storm, I needed my evidence to survive it. And somewhere around 3 a.m., Dana finally texted back with 2 words that made my heart kick hard against my ribs. Call me. And when I did, her voice was low, alert. And she said, start from the beginning. And I did. I told her about the firing, the pre-written headline, the smear campaign, and then I told her the part. I'd never said out loud to anyone that Logan Whitmore had been my secret, that he'd used me and discarded me, and that I had proof his company wasn't just toxic, it was rotten. And Dana listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a beat of silence. Then she said, if what you're telling me is true, this is bigger than a leak, and I said, it is. And she said, I need documents. And I said, you'll have them. And then she said the sentence that made everything real. Mia, once we publish, they're going to come for you. And I looked around my small apartment. The cheap lamp, the stack of bills, the framed graduation photo of me smiling like I thought life would be fair. And I said, they already did. And I meant it. Because the coming for me part had already happened. The difference was now I was ready. And after we hung up, I sat in the dark and watched the rain slide down the glass like tears the sky couldn't hold back. And I thought about Sloane's smile. The way she'd whispered to Logan in the lobby. The way he'd smirked. And I pictured their wedding, big, glossy, full of donors and board members and influencers. A celebration of a lie. And I didn't want to ruin it because I was jealous. I wanted to ruin it because it would be the perfect stage for the truth. Because karma doesn't always strike in private. Sometimes it waits for the spotlight. And as dawn began to thin the darkness, I made myself a promise I repeated like a prayer. I will not disappear quietly. I will not carry your crimes on my back. And I will not let you marry your future while you bury mine. And with that, I began the first move of my revenge, not with screaming, not with threats, but with a calm email to the Whitmore Tech Board's compliance address, an address they advertised like a shield, and in the subject line I wrote, formal notice of retaliation and evidence of executive misconduct, and in the body I wrote, I have documented proof of criminal and unethical directives issued by CEO Logan Whitmore. Any attempt to defame me publicly will be met with full disclosure to regulatory authorities and the press, and I attached nothing yet, because this first message was a knock on the door, a warning that I was no longer alone in the hallway, and when I hit send, I felt the shift, subtle but real, like the chessboard had just been turned toward them, and somewhere in that glass tower downtown, people who thought I was powerless were about to realize they'd made a very expensive mistake. The morning the first article dropped, I was standing in line for coffee, wearing sunglasses indoors like a cliche because I hadn't slept, and my eyes were swollen from staring at screens and second-guessing every move. And I remember how ordinary everything felt. The hiss of the espresso machine, the barista calling out names, while my phone vibrated in my hand with the force of a small earthquake, notification after notification, stacking up like dominoes falling in fast forward, and when I finally opened the link Dana sent with the message "It's live," my chest tightened in a way that felt like fear and relief braided together, because there it was, in black and white, not my version, not a rant, not a plea, but a clean, precise story that laid out how Whitmore Tech's internal data controls had been compromised by executive-level directives, how a senior female employee, unnamed, now had been terminated hours before a pre-written media narrative accused her of the breach, and how multiple sources suggested a deliberate effort to scapegoat that employee to protect leadership. And as I scrolled, my hands shook, not because the story was weak, but because it was strong, stronger than I dared hope, and I knew instantly that Logan would read it the same way, not as journalism, but as a threat. And I wasn't wrong, because before I even reached the counter to order my coffee, my phone rang with an unknown number, and something in my gut told me exactly who it was. And when I answered, Logan's voice slid into my ear like oil, smooth and falsely calm, saying my name like he still owned it, telling me I'd made a very serious mistake, telling me I didn't understand how things worked at his level, telling me he could fix this if I stopped talking, and I listened without interrupting, because there's a power in letting men like him reveal themselves. And when he finally paused, expecting me to beg or explain, I said quietly, "You already fixed it, Logan. You fixed it when you decided I was disposable." And he laughed then, actually laughed, like I was being dramatic, like this was still a game he could steer. And he said, "You don't have proof of anything that matters." And that was when I felt the calm settle in again. The same calm I'd felt in the lobby. And I said, "I sent copies to my attorney last night," which wasn't even a lie, just an incomplete truth. And the silence on the other end was so sudden, it was almost funny. And then his tone shifted, sharp and controlled, and he said, "You think this ends well for you?" And I said, "It already ended. This is the sequel." And I hung up before he could say another word, because I wasn't interested in his fear anymore. I was interested in his unraveling. And by the time I finally sat down with my coffee, my phone buzzed again, this time with messages from former coworkers, people who'd gone quiet. The day I was fired, people who'd unfollowed me or left me on read, now suddenly brave enough to say things like, "I'm so sorry, and I always knew something was off, and if anyone deserves this, it's you." And I read them all, but I didn't reply yet, because I knew what this phase was, the part, where people want to be on the right side of history once it looks safer. And I didn't resent them, not really. I just filed it away as another lesson, because revenge isn't just about punishment, it's about clarity, about seeing who people really are when the power shifts, and as the day wore on. The story spread faster than any internal memo ever had. Investors started asking questions. The company's stock dipped just enough to make board members nervous. And by noon, Whitmore Tech released a statement calling the article misleading and the product of a disgruntled former employee. Which made me laugh out loud in my apartment, because of course they did. Of course I was disgruntled, like that was an insult instead of a natural response to being framed, and Dana texted me almost immediately after saying, "They're rattled." I have 2 more sources calling me back, and I felt something like pride bloom in my chest. Not the flashy kind, but the quiet kind that comes when your instincts are validated. And that afternoon I took my first real risk, because I knew one article wasn't enough. I knew Logan would try to bury it, spin it, outlast it, and if I wanted to break the narrative, I had to step into it myself. So I agreed to an on-the-record interview under my own name, not because I wanted attention, but because I wanted accountability. And when Dana asked if I was sure, I said, "I'm done hiding." And that was the truth, because hiding is what they expect from women they've wronged. And I wasn't interested in meeting expectations anymore. So we met in a quiet office the next day, and when the camera turned on and she asked me to tell my story, my voice didn't shake. Not because I wasn't scared, but because fear had already spent itself. And I talked about my role at the company, about the directives I'd been given, about the moment I realized I was being set up, and I talked about the culture that protects men like Logan while devouring people like me. And when the interview aired that night, my name trended in a way I never wanted, but couldn't avoid. Strangers picked sides, some calling me brave, others calling me bitter, some accusing me of lying for attention, others sharing their own stories of being silenced. And I read more than I should have, because I wanted to understand the shape of the storm I'd stepped into. And somewhere in the middle of that noise, a message came through that made everything sharpen into focus. An email from Whitmore Tech's legal team, offering a settlement so large it made my stomach flip, with one condition spelled out in careful language. A. Full retraction and a public statement clearing Logan of wrongdoing, and I stared at that number for a long time. Because it represented safety, comfort, an easy exit, the chance to walk away and rebuild quietly, and for a split second I imagined what it would feel like to accept it, to close my laptop and never think about that company again, and then I imagined Logan standing at the altar, untouched, validated, and I felt something harden inside me because this was never about money, it was about truth, and I forwarded the email straight to Dana and my attorney, and I replied with a single sentence. Any further contact should be directed through counsel. And when I hit send, I knew there was no going back, and the retaliation came fast after that. Because power doesn't like being challenged, it likes being obeyed. So anonymous accounts started posting old photos of me out. Of context, implying relationships that didn't exist, questioning my mental health, dredging up mistakes I'd made in my 20s, like they were evidence of criminal intent. And one night, as I scrolled through a thread dissecting my face and my tone and my credibility like I was a product review, I felt the old urge rise up, the urge to defend myself to strangers who didn't know me. And instead, I closed the app and opened my files, because the best response to a smear is proof. And I realized then that it was time to release the piece Logan feared most, the audio file. The one where his voice was clear and unmistakable, instructing me to manipulate internal numbers just until after the quarter, and when I sent it to Dana, she called me immediately, her voice tight with adrenaline, saying, "This changes everything." And I said, "That's the idea," and the night it went live, I watched the fallout in real time, watched commentators who doubted me go quiet, watched analysts pause mid-sentence when the clip played, watched Logan's public persona fracture just enough to show the man underneath, and within hours, the board announced an independent review, which was corporate language for panic, and for the first time since this began, I slept, not well, not peacefully, but deeply, like my body finally trusted me to handle what was coming, and when I woke up, my phone was filled with messages from women I didn't know, telling me they'd worked under Logan, telling me they'd been pressured, silenced, pushed out, and I realized something then that shifted the entire shape of my anger, because this wasn't just my story anymore. It was a pattern, and patterns are harder to dismiss, so I connected those women with Dana, with my attorney, with each other, and slowly, a chorus formed where there had only been whispers, and the more voices joined in, the smaller Logan's denials sounded, until even his most loyal allies started hedging their support, and then came the invitation, delivered through a publicist who sounded exhausted, an offer to clarify the situation at Logan and Sloane's upcoming wedding, a request framed as a courtesy, asking me not to distract from a personal celebration, and I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was revealing, because even now, even as the walls closed in, they were. Worried about optics, about appearances, about keeping the lie intact for one more perfect day, and that was when the final piece of my plan clicked into place, because I realized the wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was leverage, a room full of donors, board members, politicians, and journalists, all gathered to witness a fairy tale, and fairy tales shatter beautifully when the truth walks in, and I didn't need to crash it, I didn't need to make a scene, I just needed to let timing do the work, so I coordinated with Dana and her editor, setting an embargo for the final story, the one that tied everything together, the shell company, the redirected data, the retaliation, the pattern of abuse, all backed by documents and voices and timelines that couldn't be waved away, and we scheduled it for the morning of the wedding, early enough to spread, late enough to land. And the night before, as I sat alone in my apartment, Watching the city lights flicker like distant signals, I felt the weight of what I was about to do press down on me. Not guilt, but gravity. Because this was the moment where revenge stopped being personal and became inevitable, and I understood. Then that karma doesn't rush, it waits until the stage is set, and when I finally turned off the light and lay in the dark, I wasn't thinking about Logan or Sloan or the company anymore. I was thinking about the woman I'd been before all of this, the one who believed silence was safer, and I whispered to her, like she could hear me across time, "Watch what happens next." The morning of the wedding arrived clear and almost offensively beautiful, the kind of day people describe as blessed, and I watched it unfold from my apartment window with a cup of coffee I barely tasted, my phone lying face up on the table like a ticking clock, because at exactly 9:00 a.m., the final story went live, and I knew that somewhere across the city, Logan Whitmore was adjusting his cufflinks, Sloan Mercer was being laced into a dress worth more than my car, and neither of them yet understood that the narrative they'd rehearsed for months was about to collapse under the weight of the truth. And when my phone buzzed with Dana's message, "It's out," I didn't cheer, I didn't smile, I just closed my eyes and breathed. Because this wasn't victory the way movies sell it. It was release, the kind that comes when you finally stop carrying someone else's lies. And when I opened the article, I saw how carefully it had been assembled. Every piece placed where it belonged. The shell company traced through filings and financial records. The internal emails showing how data had been redirected. The audio clip embedded with context that made Logan's voice undeniable. The testimony of women who'd stepped forward, each story different in detail but identical in pattern, and my name there too, not as a victim, not as a villain, but as a witness. And within minutes the internet did what it always does. When the truth is too loud to ignore, it amplified. It dissected, it argued, and it shared. And by the time the first guests were arriving at the venue, an old estate dressed up with white tents and strings of lights, Logan's phone was already lighting up with calls he couldn't silence, and I know this not because I was there, but because one of the board members texted me, a man who hadn't returned my emails weeks earlier, writing simply, "We need to talk." And I set the phone down without replying, because today wasn't about talking, it was about watching accountability finally find its way into the room, and as the hours passed, the fallout unfolded in layers. First the commentators retracting earlier doubts, then the investors demanding explanations, then the regulatory agencies confirming they'd opened formal inquiries, and finally the statement from Whitmore Tech's board, terse and carefully worded, announcing Logan's immediate resignation pending investigation. And I imagined the moment that announcement reached the wedding, imagined the whispers rippling through the rows of chairs, the way smiles stiffen when phones come out, the way champagne loses its sparkle when reality intrudes, and I wondered, briefly, what Sloan felt in that moment, whether she was furious or stunned or simply calculating her next move, and I realized that for the first time, her feelings weren't my responsibility, because I'd spent too long cushioning the consequences for people who never cushioned mine, and somewhere between. The ceremony that may or may not have happened, and the reception that definitely didn't, the story crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Because when a second outlet picked it up, then a third, the narrative shifted from scandal to reckoning, and Logan's name, once synonymous with innovation and leadership, became shorthand for everything wrong with the culture he'd built, and I didn't need to see his face to know what that did to him, because I'd seen it happen to others, I'd watched him cut them loose to save himself, and now the blade had finally turned inward, and as the day wore on, my apartment filled with sunlight and messages, some supportive, some furious, some apologetic, and I answered only a few. The ones from women who told me they'd stayed quiet for years because they thought it wouldn't matter. because they thought no one would listen, because they thought the cost was too high, and I told them the truth I'd learned the hard way. Silence is expensive too. It just charges you over time. And that evening, as the city shifted into night, Dana called me, her voice tired but satisfied, telling me the piece had broken readership records, telling me the response was overwhelming, telling me this would be studied, referenced, cited, and I thanked her, not with the gratitude of someone who'd been saved, but with the respect of someone who'd been believed. And when we hung up, I sat alone on my couch and let the quiet settle, because the adrenaline was gone now, replaced by something softer and more complex, something that felt like grief for the version of my life I'd lost, and pride for the one I'd protected. And I thought about the job I'd poured myself into, the future I'd imagined there, the loyalty I'd given freely to people who treated it like a resource to be mined. And I realized that revenge hadn't given me my old life back. It had given me something better, clarity, because clarity is the opposite of control. And control was the only thing Logan had ever really valued. And over the next few days, the consequences kept stacking, the way they do once momentum takes over. Logan's speaking engagements canceled, his advisory roles quietly dissolved, sponsors distancing themselves, Sloan scrubbing her social media and issuing a statement about personal matters, and Whitmore Tech appointing an interim CEO and promising cultural reform. Promises I watched with cautious detachment, because I knew how easily words could be used to paper overwrought, and I wasn't interested in their redemption arc. I was interested in my own, and that came in the form of a call I hadn't expected, from a firm I'd once admired, asking if I'd consider consulting on compliance and ethics restructuring, not as a figurehead, not as a symbol, but as an expert. And when I said yes, it wasn't because I needed validation. It was because I wanted to turn what I'd survived into something useful, something that might make it harder for the next woman to be erased. And as I stepped into that new work, I noticed how differently I carried myself, how the fear that used to whisper, "Don't rock the boat," had been replaced by a steadier voice that said, "Tell the truth and let the waves do what they do." And one evening, weeks later, I ran into Craig by accident at a grocery store, his confidence gone soft around the edges, and he tried to apologize in that vague way people do when they're more uncomfortable than remorseful. And I listened politely before telling him I hoped he'd learned something, not about me, but about thee. Cost of looking away, and I walked out before he could respond, because closure doesn't always come from conversations. Sometimes it comes from boundaries. And as the months passed, the investigations turned into charges. The charges turned into settlements. And Logan's name faded from headlines into footnotes, not because he was forgiven, but because the world moved on. And I did too. And one quiet morning, as I sat at my desk in a new office with sunlight pouring in and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, I thought back to that moment in the lobby when my badge stopped working, when I stood there feeling erased, and I wished I could tell that version of myself what I know now, that losing a place in a system built on lies isn't failure, it's freedom. That revenge doesn't always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like refusing to disappear. And that karma isn't magic. It's math. It's cause and effect catching up in its own time. And if there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that you don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to tell the truth and stay standing long enough for it to echo. And as I closed my laptop at the end of that day and stepped outside into the open air, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Logan, before the company, before the lie, a quiet, unshakable sense that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because I'd won, but because I'd survived with my integrity intact. And that, in the end, was the only revenge that ever really mattered.
It's funny how life can twist itself into knots and then somehow straighten out again. Thanks for listening and being here.